The Norfolk County Courthouse greeted Javon Taylor with the cold, unfriendly echo of footsteps on the marble floor. He nervously pulled on his only decent shirt, the one he'd worn to his high school graduation 3 years ago. The sleeves seemed a little short, and the collar was a little stingy. The excitement turned the minutes of anticipation into hours. Javon was 22 years old, and today was his first time in a courtroom as a defendant. His dark skin contrasted with the pallor of the walls, as if to emphasize how much of a stranger he was here. Hands that he usually held with confidence, whether it was when dealing with patients at his medical school practice or delivering orders at his part-time job, were now out of place. Time stretched agonizingly slow. Javon understood that his case was minor compared to the other cases on the court calendar, a parking violation and allegedly disobeying a police officer. But for him, a medical student who was barely making ends meet by paying tuition, any fine was a significant blow to the budget. When his defense attorney, Amara Sanford, entered the room, Javon felt faint relief. She was the only friendly face among a sea of formal suits and stern expressions. "Javon, remember, only tell the truth, but keep it short and to the point," Amara whispered, taking a seat next to him. "Judge Hampton, she has a reputation for being strict, but we can handle it." Javon nodded, feeling his mouth dry up. "All rise, Judge Victoria Hampton." The courtroom came to life as everyone rose from their seats. Judge Hampton entered with a measured stride, a tall woman with perfectly styled graying hair and a gaze that seemed to see right through people. She was about 57 years old, and every wrinkle in her face seemed to speak of experience and power. She lowered herself into her chair with the majestic slowness of a queen occupying a throne. "Sit down," she said, and her voice sounded unexpectedly harsh for such a restrained appearance. The misdemeanor parsing began. Javon was fourth on the list, and each previous case was reviewed with the same impassive expression on the judge's face. She imposed fines and issued warnings with mechanical efficiency. "Case number 134, Javon Taylor, parking violation in an emergency services zone and disobeying a law enforcement officer," the clerk announced. Javon stood up, feeling his heart pounding somewhere in his throat. Judge Hampton looked at him over her glasses, and something in her gaze had changed, a subtle stiffness that hadn't been there before. "Mr. Taylor, do you understand the nature of the charges against you?" she asked, emphasizing the word "Mr." in a way that made it sound almost mocking. "Yes, Your Honor," Javon answered, trying to keep his voice steady. "And how do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor." A faint whisper rippled through the room. Judge Hampton raised an eyebrow. "Interesting," she said. "Not guilty. Prosecutor, present the case." Prosecutor Raymond Foster rose from his seat. He was of medium height, with a budding bald spot, which he carefully disguised with slicked back hair and piercing eyes. He was about 48 years old and wore his suit like armor. "Your Honor, the facts are clear." The defendant parked his car in an area reserved exclusively for emergency vehicles at the west entrance of Norfolk City Hospital. When Officer Jenkins asked him to move the vehicle, the defendant refused to comply and engaged in a verbal altercation with the lawman. Judge Hampton listened with a growing look of disapproval on her face. "Well, Mr. Taylor," she said when the prosecutor had finished, "you seem to have trouble understanding simple rules and respecting authority figures. What do you have to say for yourself?" Amara Sanford stood up. "Your Honor, if I may, this situation has extenuating circumstances that—" "I was asking your client, Miss Sanford," Judge Hampton interrupted her. "I'm wondering how Mr. Taylor himself would explain his behavior, assuming, of course, he can formulate a coherent explanation." Amara tensed, but forced herself to sit up. Javon felt his cheeks begin to burn with humiliation. "Your Honor, I work as a medication delivery person for patients who can't make it to the pharmacy on their own. That day, I was delivering life-saving heart medication for Mr. Collins, who had recently undergone surgery, and—" "Mr. Taylor," Judge Hampton interrupted him with a barely concealed chuckle. "I didn't ask for your life story. You parked in an emergency zone?" "Yes, Your Honor, but only because—" "You refused to comply with an officer's request to move your car?" "I asked for 5 minutes to—" "Yes or no, Mr. Taylor?" Javon swallowed. "Technically, yes, but—" "Technically," Judge Hampton mocked him, and several people in the room laughed quietly. "Technically, is a favorite word of those who seek to justify their misdeeds. There is no technically in matters of law, young man. Amara tried to interject again. Your Honor, my client was acting in an emergency situation. Mr. Collins, to whom he was delivering the medication, needed it urgently. His condition could have deteriorated dramatically without— Miss Sanford, the judge interrupted, your client is not an EMT or a firefighter. That's what this parking lot is for. If everyone who thinks their business is urgent starts ignoring the rules, we're going to have chaos. She shifted her gaze back to Javan, eyeing him from head to toe with an assessing look. Mr. Taylor, I see that you're young and probably think the rules are for everyone but you. Let's just say your manner of dress and demeanor speaks volumes. Javan felt the muscles in his jaw tense. His shirt was ironed and buttoned, and he was even wearing the tie he'd borrowed from his roommate. Your Honor, he said quietly, I respect the law and the rules. I did find myself in a difficult situation between strictly enforcing parking regulations and helping an elderly person who— Oh, I'm sure you find yourself in difficult situations all the time, Judge Hampton observed sarcastically. It's amazing how often some people find themselves in circumstances that force them to break the law. At that point, Amara stood up decisively. Your Honor, I must object to such remarks. They are irrelevant and could be perceived as prejudicial. Judge Hampton looked coldly at the defense counsel. Overruled, Miss Sanford. I'm simply stating the facts based on the case file and your client's behavior. If you think that's bias, perhaps you should reconsider your own perception. Javan could feel the resentment building inside, but years of upbringing had taught him to restrain his emotions in front of authority figures, especially when you're a young black male in a system that seemed to be rigged against you from the start. Your Honor, he began again, trying to speak calmly and clearly. In my job, I deliver medication to people who can't leave their homes. Mr. Collins is an 80-year-old veteran with heart failure. He ran out of pills that day and his daughter called in a panic. I parked for 5 minutes to carry the medication to his apartment. When the officer asked me to move my car, I explained the situation and asked for literally 2 minutes to complete the delivery. And you think your 2 minutes is more important than allowing an ambulance to drive unobstructed to the hospital entrance? Judge Hampton shook her head with an expression of theatrical disappointment. Typical arrogance. There were 4 more seats available, Your Honor, Javan added quietly. Judge Hampton straightened sharply. You were counting the empty seats, instead of immediately obeying the lawful request of an authority figure? That only adds to your guilt, Mr. Taylor. She looked at the papers in front of her. Plus, it says here that you raised your voice at Officer Jenkins. I wasn't yelling, Your Honor. I was just trying to explain— Oh, I'm sure you were just trying to explain. Judge Hampton said the words in a tone that made them sound almost like an insult. You know, Mr. Taylor, I hear explanations like that every day in my courtroom. And the interesting thing is, they always sound the same. I just wanted to. I didn't think I would. Self-justifications instead of accepting responsibility. Javan felt his hands involuntarily clench into fists and forced himself to relax. I realize I've violated parking regulations, Your Honor. I'm willing to pay the appropriate fine. But I wasn't disrespecting the officer. I was just trying to explain why I needed a few more minutes. And when the explanation didn't work, you decided you could ignore the officer's direct order? Judge Hampton shook her head. You know what I see, Mr. Taylor? I see a young man who thinks the rules are made for others, but not for him. A man who thinks his assessment of the situation is more important than the professional judgment of a police officer. The judge paused, clearly enjoying her power in this moment. And, unfortunately, I see before me a typical example of how that kind of attitude is formed and encouraged in certain communities. A wave of whispers passed through the courtroom. Amara jumped to her feet. Your Honor, I strongly object to that kind of innuendo if you mean— Miss Sanford, I wasn't making any innuendo, as you put it. Judge Hampton interrupted her coldly. I'm talking about communities that have no respect for law and order. If you interpret my words differently, that's your problem, not mine. Amara remained standing, her face expressing restrained indignation. In that case, Your Honor, I ask that it be entered into the record that the defense finds the court's comments biased and irrelevant. Sustained, the judge replied dryly. Now, if you're done with the dramatic gestures, let's get back to business. She turned again to Javan, who stood straight, trying to remain outwardly calm, though inside he was seething with injustice. Mr. Taylor, you have been found guilty of violating the rules for parking in an emergency zone and disobeying a law enforcement officer. I'm issuing you a fine of $1,000 for the first offense and $500 for the second. Javan felt the ground go from under his feet. $150,000 was the amount he was saving for the next semester of medical school. Your Honor, Amara intervened, that's a disproportionately high fine for a violation like this. Normal practice suggests no more than $200 for improper parking and— Miss Sanford. Judge Hampton's voice sounded like steel. I'm quite aware of customary practice, but in this case we are dealing not only with a parking violation, but also with a demonstrative disrespect for a representative of the law and a lack of remorse. It seems to me that only a substantial financial lesson would make your client think twice about her behavior. She smiled, a cold smile that didn't reach her eyes. Besides, perhaps this experience will serve as a lesson not only for Mr. Taylor, but for other young men who believe that their personal circumstances are more important than public policy. The judge tapped her gavel. Next case. Javan sank slowly to the bench, feeling the injustice of this situation pressing down on him with a physical weight. $150,000. Money he'd saved, saving for everything, working nights and weekends while his classmates rested or studied. Money that was supposed to help him realize his dream of becoming a doctor. Amara leaned toward him, her eyes expressing genuine sympathy. We'll appeal, she whispered. What happened today is not justice, it's— She didn't finish her sentence, but Javan understood. It was a show of power, a humiliation carried out publicly and with carefully rehearsed brutality. Walking out of the courtroom, Javan felt devastated. In the hallway, he stopped to catch his breath, leaning against the cold marble wall. It was then that he heard familiar voices from around the corner. Oh, Raymond, you're on a roll today, Judge Hampton laughed, her voice sounding different, light and casual. Did you see the look on that guy's face when I gave him the ticket? They never learn. You were great, Victoria, Attorney Foster replied with undisguised admiration. Although I admit, $1,000 and $1,500 for a parking ticket is harsh even by your standards. Sometimes you have to learn a lesson, the judge said nonchalantly. Anyway, we can discuss it tonight. Don't forget 8 o'clock, the Azure restaurant. And don't be late. You know how I hate waiting. When have I ever let you down? You could hear the smile in the prosecutor's voice. See you tonight, Victoria. Javan froze, unable to believe his ears. What to him had been a devastating blow to his dreams and humiliation, to them was just a normal workday, even an excuse for a joke. He felt a wave of anger rising inside, but forced himself to take a deep breath. Now was not the time or place. He quietly stepped away from the wall and headed for the exit, trying not to think about how Judge Hampton would be enjoying a fine dinner at an expensive restaurant tonight, perhaps even laughing at yet another lesson she'd taught. Judge Victoria Hampton lingered in her office longer than usual. The clock showed the beginning of 7 in the evening when she finally closed the last of her files and folded them neatly into her leather briefcase. It had been a tiring day, 17 misdemeanors, 3 civil suits, and 1 preliminary hearing in a criminal case. But despite the fatigue, she felt satisfaction. Control and order were what mattered in her world, and today she had once again upheld both of those principles. Victoria fixed her impeccably styled hair and glimpsed her reflection in the small desk mirror. 57 years old, but she still held herself upright, maintaining a stately posture that inspired respect and sometimes fear. Her face had grown more rigid over the years, the wrinkles near her eyes and mouth more noticeable, but it only added to the authority of her appearance. Tonight she had dinner with Raymond Foster at the Azure, one of Norfolk's most exclusive restaurants. She had a little over an hour to get home, freshen up, and change. Time was short, but Victoria was always known for her punctuality. She put on her dark blue jacket, grabbed her briefcase and purse, and headed for the door. Usually by this time the courthouse was empty, with only the guards and night shift staff remaining. Victoria preferred this time. She could walk through the corridors without being confronted by petitioners, attorneys, and defendants. all of whom were eager to intercept her to make some request or complaint. Her heels beat a steady rhythm on the marble floor of the corridor, echoing throughout the empty building. She nodded to the guard at the main entrance and headed for the service elevator leading to the underground parking garage. "Have a good evening, Your Honor," the guard said. "Likewise, Bill," she replied, with a polite smile that disappeared as soon as the elevator doors closed behind her. The elevator slowly descended into the underground of the building. Victoria stared absent-mindedly at the numbers changing on the scoreboard. Mentally, she was already at the restaurant, discussing a future promotion with Raymond. Rumor had it that a seat on the appeals court was about to be vacated, and she had a good chance at that appointment. Of course, the backing of a powerful prosecutor would come in handy. Reaching the underground parking garage, Victoria stepped out of the elevator. It was cool and quiet, the pungent smell of concrete and automobile exhaust filling the air. The lighting was dim, several lamps were out, and it created patches of darkness between the parked cars. Normally, this annoyed the judge, but tonight she didn't have time to think about administrative shortcomings. Dinner with the prosecutor was far more important. Her black Mercedes was parked in its usual place, in the far corner of the parking lot, where the designated spaces for judges and dignitaries are. At this hour, the parking lot was almost empty, just a few security cars and a couple of cars of late-working clerks. Victoria pressed a button on her key fob, and the car's headlights flashed in greeting. She quickened her stride, anticipating her imminent return home. A sudden pain in her chest made her slow down. It felt unpleasant, like something was squeezing her from the inside. Nothing serious, just fatigue, she thought, taking a deep breath. When the car was only a few steps away, Victoria noticed movement in the shadows between the cars. Before she could react, two figures in dark clothing and masks covering the lower part of their faces appeared in front of her. "Stay where you are," one of them, a man of medium height with a lean build, said hoarsely. Something glinted in his hand, a knife or a blade. The second, larger man took a step to the side, cutting off the escape route. Victoria froze, gripping the handle of her briefcase tighter. Her heart raced, but outwardly she kept her composure. 27 years as a judge had taught her not to show fear, even when it ran up her spine in icy waves. "What do you want?" she said with the same intonation she used in the courtroom when addressing particularly unpleasant defendants. "A purse, a watch, jewelry, and the car keys," the thin man said, taking a step closer, quickly and quietly. The second robber, a large man with broad shoulders, glanced around nervously. "Hurry up, Keith," he muttered. "Shut up," the first one snapped and turned to Victoria again. "Did you hear me? Spit it all out, or you'll be sorry." Victoria felt the anger displace the fear. How dare these scum of the earth threaten her? Her, a federal judge who had dedicated her life to upholding the law? "Do you know who I am?" she asked, standing to her full height. "I'm Federal Judge Victoria Hampton. Assaulting a federal judge will get you the maximum sentence imaginable." The robbers looked at each other. "Judge?" the big one asked worriedly. "I don't give a damn who you are," the skinny one replied, taking another step forward. "Even better, probably more money. For the last time, give me everything of value. Now." He swung the knife for conviction, and the blade glinted dimly in the parking lot darkness. Victoria wanted to respond, but suddenly felt the pain in her chest that she'd felt a moment ago return with triple the force. This time it wasn't just a heaviness. A sharp, piercing pain spread from the center of her chest to her left shoulder and neck. She involuntarily clutched at her chest, trying to inhale. "What's wrong with her?" the large robber asked fearfully. "She's faking it," the skinny one answered uncertainly. "Hey, stop that act." But Victoria wasn't faking. The pain was becoming unbearable, and dark spots swam before her eyes. She staggered, dropping the briefcase from her weakened hand. She tried to say something, but all she could manage was a stifled groan. "Shit, there's something wrong with her," the big one said nervously. "Keith, I didn't sign up for this. She really doesn't look good." "Shut up, Leroy," the skinny one hissed, but his voice betrayed concern too. Victoria felt her legs give out. She slumped against her car, struggling to gasp for air. Her heart was pounding at breakneck speed, sending waves of pain through her entire body. "You..." She tried to address the robbers, but her speech was slurring. Pomo? Without speaking, Victoria slid to the cold concrete floor of the parking lot. Her purse fell beside her, her car keys clattering to the floor. Fuck! The skinny guy cursed. She passed out! It's a heart attack, Keith! Panic in the big robber's voice. That's what my dad looked like before he— Shit! We need to call an ambulance! Are you crazy? What the fuck is an ambulance? Hissed the one they called Keith. We're going to jail! She's a judge, you heard her! But we can't just leave her to die! Victoria heard their argument as if through absorbent cotton. The world went dark, the voices growing farther away. The only thing that remained real was the throbbing pain in her chest, and the feeling that she couldn't fill her lungs with air, as if someone had placed a heavy stone on her chest. We have to get out, Keith insisted. Now, there are cameras and guards here. Someone will find her. But if she dies, then we'll be the murderers of a federal judge. Is that what you want? Move, now. The last thing Victoria heard before consciousness finally left her was the sound of hurried footsteps retreating across the concrete floor of the parking lot. Then there was silence and darkness. Javon Taylor was devastated by the court's decision, but he couldn't afford to indulge in sorrowful thoughts for long. He still had obligations to fulfill, work to do. After the hearing, he returned to the pharmacy where he worked part-time as a drug delivery man. That evening, he had 3 more orders to deliver before the pharmacy closed at 9 p.m. Last on his list was a bag of medicine for Mrs. Greenberg, an elderly woman who lived just a block from the courthouse. Fate was ironic. Once again, he had to park next to the very building where a few hours ago he had been humiliated and fined an amount of money that jeopardized all his plans and dreams. After delivering Mrs. Greenberg's medication, Javon decided not to go straight back to the pharmacy. He needed time to think, to decide what to do next. $150,000 was a catastrophic amount of money for a student who paid his own tuition. He could take extra shifts, but then his studies would suffer. It was a vicious circle. He parked his old Honda Civic in a public parking lot near the courthouse and decided to walk to clear his head. The evening air was fresh, with a slight odor of salt. The wind was blowing from the bay side. Involuntarily, Javon headed toward the courthouse, a huge concrete monolith, a symbol of a system that today proved once again that for people like him, justice was a relative concept. As he passed the service entrance, he noticed that the gate leading to the underground parking lot was open. Normally it closed automatically, but now it was half open. A technical malfunction, Javon thought, but some strange feeling made him stop. Something wasn't right. He hesitated only a moment before stepping inside. If security saw him here, he'd be in trouble, but an inner voice, the same one that always made him help others, said to check it out. The underground parking lot greeted him with semi-darkness and a humming silence. A few cars were parked in their spots, but there were no people in sight. Javon moved forward cautiously, feeling like an uninvited guest. He was about to turn back when he heard a faint sound, something between a groan and an intermittent sigh. Javon froze, listening. The sound was repeated, barely audible but definitely human. He quickened his step, moving toward the sound, and a few seconds later he spotted a dark figure stretched out on the floor beside the black Mercedes. "Hey!" he called, quickening his step. "Do you need help?" As he got closer, Javon was surprised and horrified to recognize Judge Hampton. She was lying on her side, one hand clutched to her chest, her face contorted with pain. Items scattered from her purse, lipstick, wallet, cell phone, some papers, were lying nearby. For a moment Javon froze, his mind flashing back to the events of today, the humiliation in the courtroom, the unjust fine, the cold mockery in the woman's eyes when she effectively destroyed his hopes for the future. But that moment lasted only a second. In the next instant, the medical student's professional instincts took over. "Judge Hampton!" He knelt down beside her, quickly assessing the situation. "Can you hear me?" Victoria was unconscious, but breathing, heavy and ragged. Javon checked her pulse, weak and irregular. Her skin was pale and covered in cold sweat. All signs pointed to a heart attack. Acting quickly and methodically, as he had been taught in his first aid courses, Javan undid the top buttons of the judge's blouse to make breathing easier. He then gently rolled her over onto her back and raised her legs slightly, using his jacket as a pillow. "Hang in there, help is on the way," he said, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. Javan grabbed the judge's cell phone, which was on the floor next to her, but the screen was smashed, apparently dropped when she passed out. He pulled out his own phone and dialed 9111. "Emergency services, what's your emergency?" the dispatcher answered. "I need an ambulance," Javan said clearly. "The underground parking lot of the federal courthouse on Granby Street. Woman appears to be having a heart attack. 50 or so, unconscious, pulse weak and irregular, breathing labored." "A crew is on its way," the dispatcher replied. "Stay on the line. Do you know first aid?" "Yes, I'm a medical student," Javan replied, not taking his eyes off the judge's pale face. "I've already secured an airway and elevated his legs." "Good. Does the patient have any known cardiac conditions?" "I don't know," Javan answered. "This is Federal Judge Victoria Hampton." There was a brief pause on the line. "Got it. Ambulance is on its way, should be here in about 5 minutes. Continue to monitor his breathing and pulse. If it worsens, notify me immediately." Javan put the phone on speaker and focused on the judge again. Her breathing was becoming shallower and her pulse weaker. He didn't like those signs. "Judge Hampton," he called out. "Victoria, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, but her eyes did not open. Suddenly, her breathing became ragged and then stopped. "No, no, no." Javan quickly checked for a pulse on her carotid artery. Nothing. "Her heart had stopped," he yelled into the phone. "Start CPR," the dispatcher responded immediately. "The ambulance would be here in 3 minutes." Javan moved into position and began chest compressions, rhythmic, firm presses on the center of his chest, just as he'd been taught. 30 compressions, 2 breaths, he repeated mentally. "Hold on," he whispered between clenched teeth, doing his best to get Judge's heart beating again. "Don't you dare die. Not today." The minutes dragged on interminably. Sweat flooded Javan's eyes, but he didn't stop resuscitating. Suddenly, Judge Hampton took a convulsive breath, and her chest began to rise on its own. "She's breathing!" exclaimed Javan, quickly checking for a pulse. "She's got a pulse!" "Good," the dispatcher called back. "An ambulance is on its way to the building." Indeed, within seconds, Javan heard the sirens and saw the flashing lights reflecting on the concrete walls of the parking lot. A medical team quickly found them and brought the situation under control. "You did good, kid," one of the paramedics said as he hooked up an oxygen machine. "You probably saved her life." Javan stepped aside, giving the paramedics room to work. He watched as they stabilized the judge, hooking up monitors, putting in IVs, preparing her for transport. It all seemed unreal, like a strange dream in which the events of the day were jumbled together. When the judge was about to be transferred to the stretcher, she opened her eyes. Her gaze, cloudy and disoriented, slid over the faces of those around her, then stopped on Javan. Something flashed in her gaze, surprise? Recognition? But she was too weak to speak. "We're taking her to Norfolk Medical Center," the paramedic said, turning to Javan. "Do you know if she has any relatives who need to be notified?" Javan shook his head. "The police will take care of it," the paramedic decided. "They're on their way." "Do you want to come with us?" Javan hesitated. Why should he go? This woman had humiliated him just a few hours ago, effectively denying him the opportunity to continue his training. But something in her gaze, in the way she'd looked at him a second ago, vulnerable, helpless, didn't let him just walk away. "Yes," he finally decided. "I'll go." As they loaded Judge Hampton into the ambulance, Javan couldn't help but think about how strange this day's fate had turned out to be. In the morning, this woman had looked down on him with contempt and arrogance, and now her life was literally in his hands. But Javan felt no satisfaction or revenge, only a strange mixture of compassion and anxiety. After all, whatever their differences, she was just a human being, as mortal as himself. And right now she needed help, not judgment. Climbing into the ambulance after the stretcher, he thought that maybe this strange coincidence hadn't happened by chance. Maybe it was that rare moment when life gave him a chance to change something important, not just for him, but for her too. The doors of the ambulance closed and the vehicle rolled away, taking them both toward the unknown. Norfolk Medical Center greeted Javin with the bright lights and bustle of the emergency room. The ambulance stopped at the entrance, and the medical team instantly went into cohesive action mode. Judge Hampton remained in stable, serious condition, oxygen mask on her face, IV in her arm, monitors recording every heartbeat. Female, 57 years old, suspected acute myocardial infarction, cardiac arrest on scene, successful resuscitation performed by a bystander until the team arrived, the paramedic reported as they quickly moved the gurney down the hallway. Javon followed a short distance behind them, unsure of what to do next. Now that the judge was in the hands of professionals, his presence seemed unnecessary. But something held him back. A sense of incompleteness, as if his part in this story wasn't over yet. At the door of the intensive care unit, the medical staff stopped him. "I'm sorry, it's just the nursing staff next." Javon nodded and retreated to the waiting area. He sank into the hard plastic chair and for the first time in the last hour fully realized what had happened. His hands shook slightly, an echo of the adrenaline that was still circulating in his system. "Are you related to Judge Hampton?" The voice belonged to the policeman who had stealthily approached him. "No, Javin stammered, not knowing how to explain his strange connection to the judge. "I found her in the parking lot and called an ambulance." "Are you Javon Taylor?" the officer asked, checking his notebook. "Dispatch said you were a medical student." "Yeah, that's me. We're going to need to ask you some questions about what happened." Javon briefly told the officer everything he knew, how he found the judge unconscious, the signs of a heart attack, the resuscitative measures he had to perform. He didn't mention what had happened between them earlier in the courtroom. That seemed unimportant now. Cameras in the parking lot captured two men running away around the same time, the officer said. "Did you see them?" Javin shook his head. "When I got there, the judge was already alone. Maybe it was a robbery interrupted by her heart attack," the officer said thoughtfully. "In any case, it's a good thing you were there. Not everyone would have rushed to the rescue." Not everyone, Javon thought, especially someone she humiliated just a few hours ago. Suddenly, the doors of the ward swung open, and a young woman in a medical gown ran out of there. Her brown hair was gathered into a careless bun, and her eyes, an exact replica of Judge Hampton's eyes, were full of anxiety. "Where is my mother?" she demanded of the nurse behind the counter. "I was told Judge Hampton had just been brought in with a heart attack." "Dr. Hampton," the nurse replied sympathetically. "Your mother's in ICU 1. Dr. Shepard is with her now." The young woman nodded and was about to walk through the ward doors when the officer called out to her. "Dr. Hampton, this is Javin Taylor. He gave your mother first aid. In fact, saved her life." Olivia Hampton stopped and turned to Javin. Her look was a mixture of shock and gratitude. "You—" She stepped closer, holding out her hand. "I don't know how to thank you. I just did what I had to do," Javon replied, shaking her hand. Olivia studied his face carefully, as if trying to memorize every feature. "The officer said you were a medical student?" "Yeah, 3rd year at Eastern Virginia Medical College." "You were in the right place at the right time," she said. "If it weren't for your skills—" She didn't finish the sentence, and Javin saw tears glisten in her eyes. Olivia pulled herself together quickly. "I need to go to her, but I'd like to talk to you later, if you don't mind waiting." "Of course," Javin nodded. "I'm in no hurry." Olivia smiled gratefully and quickly disappeared behind the ward doors. Javon sank back into his chair. It had been over an hour since he'd found Judge Hampton in the parking lot, and fatigue was starting to take its toll. He closed his eyes, but in his mind's eye, he kept seeing the judge's pale face, her lifeless body, feeling her ribs under his palms during the compressions. Javin didn't notice he was dozing off. He was awakened by a light touch on his shoulder. Olivia Hampton was standing next to him, relief in her eyes. "She's stabilized," Olivia said. "She'll need surgery, but there's no immediate threat to her life." "I'm glad to hear that," Javon replied sincerely. "Could we talk in the cafeteria?" Olivia suggested. "I think we could both use some coffee." They sat at a corner table in the almost empty hospital cafeteria, Olivia twirled the paper cup of coffee in her hands, studying Javon with growing curiosity. The paramedics said you performed CPR for almost 4 minutes before they arrived, she said. Without that, Mom's chances would have been practically nil. Javon shrugged, just applying what we'd been taught. Don't be modest, Olivia smiled softly. What you did wasn't just what you did. A lot of people would have panicked or passed over it. There was a pause. Javon sensed that Olivia wanted to ask something else, but hesitated. What brought you to that parking lot? She finally said. Most people were home at this hour. Javon took a deep breath. Moment of truth. I was there. For your mother, actually, more specifically because of a case she was looking into this afternoon. Olivia's eyebrows rose in surprise. You were a party to the trial? Yes, Javon grinned wickedly. Your mother fined me $1,500 for parking and allegedly disobeying a police officer. Olivia let out a surprised exclamation. $1,500 for parking? That's disproportionate? Javon finished for her. Yeah, my defense attorney thought so too. And you still stopped to help her afterward? Was there a choice? Javon answered simply. She needed help. That's all that mattered at that moment. Olivia stared at him for a long moment, a complex expression in her eyes, a mixture of admiration, bewilderment, and some inner struggle. Mom can be tough, she said at last. Especially in recent years, since Dad left. That doesn't excuse the prejudice, Javon said quietly. No, it doesn't, Olivia agreed. I've often told her that, but she shook her head. It's a long story. What's important is what you did today, Javon. It changes everything. Before he could ask what she meant, her pager rang. I have to go, Olivia said, standing up. Mom's regaining consciousness. Would you like to come upstairs with me? Javon looked at her in surprise. Are you sure she'll want to see me? I'm sure she should, Olivia replied firmly. Let's go. The ICU room was filled with the quiet beeping of monitors and dimmed lights. Judge Hampton looked much smaller and vulnerable than she had in the courtroom, pale, with an oxygen tube in her nose and a multitude of wires stretching from her body to the medical equipment. Olivia walked over to the bed and gently took her mother's hand. Mom, can you hear me? The judge's eyelids fluttered and slowly opened. Her gaze was cloudy but gradually cleared. Olivia? Her voice was a hoarse whisper. What? Where am I? At the hospital, Mom. You had a heart attack. In the courthouse parking lot. Judge Hampton nodded weakly, the memories clearly coming back to her gradually. Those men? They wanted my bag, she whispered. The police are looking for them, Olivia replied. But what's more important now is that you're alive. And it's because of him. She gestured for Javon to come closer. He took a hesitant step toward the bed, stepping into the judge's line of sight. Her eyes flashed with surprise, then confusion, and finally recognition. You, she breathed out. You're the young man from the courthouse. Taylor? Javon Taylor, he confirmed. Glad to see you're feeling better, Your Honor. He found you in the parking lot, Mom, Olivia said softly. He performed CPR until the ambulance arrived. The doctors say you wouldn't have survived without his intervention. Judge Hampton looked at Javon as if she were seeing him for the first time. Her gaze slid over his face, studying every feature as if trying to solve a riddle. Why? She finally asked. She didn't finish the sentence, but all three of them knew what she was talking about. Javon met her gaze, because the only thing that mattered at that moment was that your life was in danger. Everything else didn't matter. Judge Hampton was silent for a long moment, and Javon could see the different emotions struggling in her eyes. May I speak to Mr. Taylor alone? She finally spoke, turning to her daughter. Olivia looked at her mother in surprise. Are you sure? You need to rest. And Dr. Shepard said, Just 5 minutes, Olivia, the judge said gently but insistently. Please. Olivia cast a concerned glance at Javon, then nodded. 5 minutes. I'll be outside the door. When it was just the two of them, the room was silent, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of the monitors. Javon shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot, not knowing whether he should sit or stand. Sit down, Mr. Taylor, the judge said, indicating a chair next to the bed with a faint gesture. Javan sat down, meeting his gaze with the woman who only a few hours ago had looked at him with a mixture of contempt and indifference. Now there was something very different in her eyes: vulnerability, confusion, and perhaps a glimmer of remorse. "I don't know how to thank you," she began in a low voice. "Words seem insufficient." "There's no need, Your Honor," Javan replied. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," she shook her head. "Not anyone. Especially not someone who'd been treated the way I treated you today." She paused, gathering her strength. "I've been unfair to you, Mr. Taylor, more than unfair. I've been prejudiced, arrogant, and cruel." Javan was silent, giving her a chance to continue. 27 years on the bench," Judge Hampton continued. "I've seen things. Gradually, you start to believe you can read people at a glance, recognize types, predict behavior, and then life teaches you a lesson. I've made 2 mistakes in my judgment today, first about you, then about those men in the parking lot." The judge looked directly into Javan's eyes. "Why did you stop to help?" "I did." Javan thought for a moment, weighing the answer. "Because that's how I was raised," he finally said. "My grandmother was a nurse. She always said, when you see a man in trouble, it doesn't matter who he is or what he's done. All that matters is that he needs help." He saw the judge's eyes fill with tears. "Your grandmother is a wise woman," she said quietly. "You were lucky to have her." "Yes," Javan agreed. "She alone raised me after my parents died, taught me everything I know about humanity." Judge Hampton closed her eyes, and for a moment Javan feared that the conversation had bored her. But then she spoke again. "This morning I saw only what I wanted to see. A young man of a certain type, of a certain appearance, from a certain neighborhood. I didn't see a medical student who moonlights delivering medicine to pay his tuition. I didn't see a man raised with an understanding of the value of helping others." She sighed heavily. "The worst mistake a judge can make is bias, and I've shown it to the fullest today." "We all make mistakes," Javan said quietly. "But not all of our mistakes can ruin other people's lives," the judge argued. $1,500. I know it's a lot of money for a student." "It was money for next semester," Javan admitted. "But I'll find a way." "No," Judge Hampton said firmly. "As soon as I get back to court, the first thing I'm going to do is rescind that fine. It's the least I can do." Javan felt the weight that had been weighing on his shoulders since the verdict began to ease. "Thank you, Your Honor." "Victoria," she said quietly. "I'm just Victoria here, the woman whose life you saved." There was a quiet knock on the door, and Olivia peeked into the room. "I'm sorry, Mother, but Dr. Shepard insists that you need to rest." Judge Hampton nodded. "Of course. Mr. Taylor was just leaving." Javan stood up, but the judge held up his hand. "We're not finished with this conversation," she said quietly. "I hope you'll visit me again." "I will," Javan promised. As he left the room, he felt strangely relieved, as if a heavy burden he didn't even know existed had suddenly disappeared from his shoulders. 3 months later, Javan was sitting in a Norfolk County courtroom again, but this time as an observer, not a defendant. He watched Judge Hampton preside over a case remarkably similar to his own. A young woman charged with a parking violation outside the children's hospital where she had brought medicine for her brother. "Miss Rodriguez," Judge Hampton addressed the defendant, "I see mitigating circumstances here. You parked in the wrong place, and that's a violation. But given the emergency nature of the situation and the fact that you did not interfere with other vehicles, I think a minimum fine of $50 with probation is fair. If you have no other violations within 6 months, the fine will be canceled." Javan noticed how surprised the prosecutor and defense counsel looked at each other. Judge Hampton, known for her toughness, was showing unexpected mercy. After the hearing, the judge noticed Javan and gestured him into her chambers. "I'm glad you're here," she said as Javan entered. "How are your studies going?" "Much better, since I didn't have to worry about the $1,500 fine." Javan smiled. The judge nodded. "I'm glad, but the main reason I invited you here is something else." She pulled an envelope out of her desk drawer and held it out to Javan. "What is it?" he asked, accepting the envelope. "A letter of recommendation for the Barnett Scholarship Program," the judge replied. Olivia told me about it. Full funding for promising medical students who have shown exceptional human qualities along with academic excellence. Javan stared at the envelope, not believing his ears. The Barnett Scholarship? But it's incredibly competitive. And you deserve it, the judge said firmly. My letter isn't a guarantee, of course, but I think a story about a medical student saving a federal judge's life by showing extraordinary mercy to a man who just hours before had treated him unfairly, that might impress the committee. Javan carefully opened the envelope and ran his eyes over the first lines of the letter. The judge's words were sincere, strong, full of respect for his deed and character. I don't know what to say, he said at last. Thank you. I'm the one who should be thanking you, Javan, Judge Hampton replied. Not just for saving my life, but for helping me see what I've become and what I don't want to be anymore. She paused to collect her thoughts. You know, sometimes we get so caught up in our narrow view of the world that we stop seeing the diversity of it. I thought I knew everything about people, that I could read them, but in reality, I was just labeling people based on my preconceptions. That's true of all of us, Javan said. It's important to recognize it and try to see beyond the first impression. Wise words for someone so young, the judge smiled. Your grandmother would be proud of you. She looked at her watch. I have to get back to work, but I'll see you at the medical center fundraiser this Saturday. Olivia said you agreed to come. Yes, I will, Javan confirmed, standing up. Great, Judge Hampton nodded. See you Saturday, Javan. The room was filled with elegantly dressed people, doctors, hospital administrators, patrons of the arts, and city officials. The Norfolk Medical Center's annual fundraiser was one of the most important events on the calendar of the local elite. Javan felt a little out of place in a borrowed tuxedo, but Olivia, who had invited him, assured him that his presence was important, not only to her mother, but to himself. Connections in the medical community are what can determine your entire future career, she said. And there's our hero, Judge Hampton exclaimed as she spotted him at the entrance. She looked very different from a courtroom or hospital room, an elegant evening gown, jewelry, and most importantly, a warm, genuine smile. She walked over to him and introduced the gray-haired man standing next to her. Dr. Barnett, this is Javan Taylor, the medical student I told you about. Javan's eyes widened. Dr. William Barnett is a legendary heart surgeon and the founder of the fellowship program he recently applied for. Mr. Taylor, Dr. Barnett shook his hand firmly. Judge Hampton told me an impressive story. It's not every day a medical student saves the life of a federal judge. I was just in the right place at the right time, sir, Javan replied. And had the necessary skills and character to act, Dr. Barnett added with an approving nod. I've studied your scholarship application carefully. Very impressed. Javan cast an appreciative glance at Judge Hampton, who nodded slightly with a smile. Actually, Dr. Barnett continued, I think we should discuss the details. The committee has reached a decision, and I am pleased to announce that you are receiving the Barnett Scholarship for the remainder of your studies. Javan froze, not believing his ears. Really? I don't know what to say. Thank you will suffice, Dr. Barnett smiled. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have other guests to greet. Judge, Mr. Taylor. He nodded to them and stepped back. Javan turned to Judge Hampton. Did you set this up? I only told the truth, she replied. You did the rest, Javan. They walked back to the window, looking out at the nightlights of Norfolk. You know, she said thoughtfully, that day changed more than just my life, literally. It changed the way I see the world and the people in it. It changed a lot of things for me, too, Javan admitted. For the better, I hope? Definitely. He smiled.